Good evening. I'm Nima and this is Forum Daily for Monday, January 16th. And tonight, a survey by the central bank finds that Canadians are cutting back on spending amid rising interest rates and prices. This is according to the Bank of Canada's fourth quarter business and consumer outlook. The central bank says its latest quarterly surveys found that more businesses than usual expect their sales to decline, and two-thirds expect a recession in the next 12 months. But it says half of businesses still said that they're planning to add employees or to fill vacant positions in that same time period. More than 7 in 10 consumers are also expecting a recession, and most workers do not expect their earnings to catch up with inflation, which both consumers and businesses expect to remain elevated in the short term. All right, well, meanwhile, a new consumer debt survey shows that Canadians are increasingly worried about how much they owe amid higher interest rates and persistent inflation. Bankruptcy trustee firm MNP says its quarterly consumer debt index dropped 15 points since its last survey to an all-time low of 77 points. A lower score on the index suggests higher anxiety about debt. The report is based on online interviews conducted in December. All right, switching gears to a look at home sales now. A new report from the Canadian Real Estate Association shows home sales are expected to go down slightly this year. CREA's updated forecast says home sales are expected to decrease by 0.5% from 2022. However, the organization expects home sales to climb 10.2% in 2024 as markets continue to return to normal. Ontario is expanding on private delivery of public health care services. Premier Doug Ford made the announcement this morning. The first stage of the new 3-phase plan is to add 14,000 cataract surgeries through new partnerships at centres in Windsor, Kitchener-Waterloo, and Ottawa. Health Minister Sylvia Jones says the province will also put $18 million in existing centres across the province. Now, this will be for MRI and CT scans, cataract surgeries, other ophthalmic surgeries, certain gynecological surgeries, and plastic surgeries. Ms. Jones confirmed the procedures will continue to be paid for by the Ontario Health Insurance Plan. All right, well, meanwhile, federal public servants are starting to transition back to in-person office work this week. A back-to-work mandate takes effect today. This with staff expected to work in person at least 2 to 3 days per week from now on. Some workers in Ottawa say the mandate lacks direction, while others are concerned about recent transit issues in the capital, posing headaches for commuters. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe says he's disappointed that he was not made aware of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's visit to his province today. Mr. Trudeau toured a rare earths element processing plant in Saskatoon with the city's mayor. Mr. Moe says rare earth development is an area that the federal and provincial governments see eye to eye on, so it's disappointing that his government was not made aware of the Prime Minister's visit. On the East Coast, freezing rain knocked out power and forced the closure of schools across much of Atlantic Canada. A sprawling winter storm continues to linger over the region after hitting over the weekend. More than 55,000 homes and businesses in Nova Scotia were in the dark earlier today because of a string of power outages. Several hundred Quebec residents filled the pews of a local church today for a mass in support of the families of 3 people who are still missing. This comes following an explosion at a propane distribution company north of Montreal last week. The mayor of Saint-Roch-de-l'Achigan, Sébastien Marcil, described the wait by loved ones for answers as unbearable. Still missing since Thursday morning's explosion and fire at Propane La Fortune are 2 employees and a subcontractor. Well, one of the most popular Vancouver Canucks players to ever suit up has died. Gino Ojic played 12 seasons in the NHL for the Canucks, New York Islanders, Philadelphia Flyers, and Montreal Canadiens. He died yesterday at the age of 52. His sister Dina Ojic shared the news on Facebook of his passing. The former enforcer had 64 goals and 73 assists in his 605 NHL games. And he holds a Canucks team record with his 2,127 penalty minutes being the most in franchise history. Canadian veterans, first responders, and their families will benefit soon from a new national program. It aims to better train and prepare mental health professionals on the unique challenges of treating such patients. The program is being offered by Wounded Warriors Canada in conjunction with the Atlas Institute for Veterans and Families. So far, about 800 healthcare professionals have participated in the online training course. We'll be right back. The latest discovery of possible grave sites at a residential school in Saskatchewan has been described as difficult news by the Prime Minister, but it does not come as a surprise to many residential school survivors. The Star Blanket Cree Nation announced last week that ground-penetrating radar has identified more than 2,000 potential targets at the former Lebret Residential School. As more residential school sites and potential unmarked graves continue to be found, one former site is looking to repurpose its grounds for learning, healing, and truth and reconciliation. The former site of the Mohawk Institute Residential School in Brantford, Ontario, is being turned into an exhibition to further tell the stories of those who had lost their voices and, for some, their lives. Well, joining us now to tell us more about this is the Woodland Cultural Centre's Executive Director, Ms. Janis Monture. Ms. Monture, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with last week's discovery at the former Lebret Residential School. How have the survivors and First Nation communities that you speak to been reacting to this?
Well, I think it's definitely something that we knew was going to be discovered at residential school sites across this country. But again, it's the numbers are the thing that's really hard to, I think, come to terms with is as many that they're suggesting that have been found of interest in Star Blanket, to over 2,000. It really shows just how many lives were lost of children who attended these institutions across this country, and with it not being reported or not being acknowledged.
And as you say, survivors expect to hear a lot more about grave sites being found at former sites, former residential school sites. So can you tell us a little bit more about the importance of this search and how it's going to help Canada in its efforts toward reconciliation?
Well, I think it's important that these searches continue to happen. We need to understand the truth, and we need to also bring some closure to our communities about the tragedy around losing children that went to these institutions, and really to, I think, acknowledge just how horrific the living conditions were and the treatment of children, of Indigenous children that attended these institutions.
Definitely. Now, we do know the former site of the Mohawk Residential School is being repurposed, so let's talk a little bit more about that. What phase is it now in its development, and what will this site look like once it's complete?
So we're currently in phase 3 of our restoration work. So we're making it sure that it's accessible. So we're installing an elevator. We are ensuring that all the masonry is repaired and windows are repaired. So that's sort of the phase we are in now, and that will continue well into the spring. At the same time, we are starting phase 4 in a few weeks. That is the interpretation phase. So really ensuring that when we do reopen in late fall of 2024, visitors will be able to experience what life was like as a child attending one of these institutions. It'll be a guided tour of the space, and really the artifact itself is the building. It's really going to be focusing on the stories and testimonials we've heard from survivors over several years, guiding the narrative and the script of the experience. So we hope that when visitors come, they'll come see the rooms as they once were when it was running as a residential school.
Really looking forward to the opening of this exhibition, Ms. Monture. Now, what are you hoping people will take away from or feel after visiting this exhibition?
I hope that when people come through this site, that they really truly understand not only the historic aspect of it, but also to really understand what it was like to be a child. I think when we hear the stories, you see the survivors are now elderly and older. It's hard to imagine what they're telling you, to know what it would have been like to be 5 years old what the living conditions were and what happened to them. We have, several abuses that were done to these children is unfathomable to, I think, a lot of people. And so we really hope that people understand the truth first and are really open to hearing those truths because they are hard to hear, but we have to ensure that we know the truth before we can do any sort of reconciliation work before we move forward.
Stories that need to be told. All right, Ms. Monture, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you.
Stay with us. We'll be right back. After the break, we're going to take a look at cybersecurity in Canada and how to stay safe. We're going to speak with Mr. Robert Falzon from Checkpoint Canada. Now, he's going to unpack the latest trends in cyber threats, how they've been evolving, and how you can protect yourself against them. After that, a look at major news stories from around the world. Of course, stay tuned. Cybersecurity experts are offering tips on protection against cyber attacks. Robert Falzon of Checkpoint Canada says keeping computers and mobile devices up to date with the latest software is critical. Mr. Falzon also suggests that people download ransomware protection software and be hyper-aware when opening emails or text messages from unknown sources. The Rogers Cybersecure Catalyst Center at Toronto Metropolitan University says the use of ransomware is growing as part of a multi-billion-dollar global crime industry. Well, joining us now to discuss cybersecurity in Canada is Mr. Robert Falzon himself. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
So as we mentioned, the use of ransomware is growing. So what do we know so far about the scale of cyber attacks in Canada in particular?
It's quite incredible. We've seen an over 20% increase in attacks for Canadian enterprises and Canadian companies over the course of the last year or so. So it continues to dramatically increase year over year. So this is not a problem that's going away anytime soon.
Very concerning problem there. Now, as technology continues to evolve, so do the threats against it. So can you tell us a little bit more about how cyber threats have been evolving most recently?
Well, what's happening really is that we're seeing now that tools are becoming more and more accessible to more people. Hackers that maybe not are as skilled as some of the ones that are the most dangerous are now finding themselves empowered with tools that are using artificial intelligence and machine learning to create attacks and to help them form different types of attacks and malware that is actually quite efficient and quite effective at attacking people. So we're seeing more in a broad range of people entering the attack marketplace, if you will.
That's really concerning that less skilled hackers are being given the tools to hack your personal information. Now, in terms of victims, we've been seeing some really big targets lately, LCBO, Sick Kids, Royal Mail. But what is the risk to maybe smaller businesses and individual Canadians here?
Well, certainly risks to brand and things like that, what we typically think with any problem that you would have with a product or a service, right? But there's also, in some cases, these things can affect your health, right? We start to see theft of things like medical records and certainly financial information, especially from those most vulnerable or more vulnerable populations even. These kinds of threats become an incredible problem for them as well. So I think that we're going to continue to see that type of attack even in the smaller mom and pop type of organizations.
So what can these small businesses or individual Canadians do to protect themselves, Mr. Falzon?
I would say straight up cyber hygiene, right? It really goes back down to the basics. There's an old saying that says you don't have to run faster than the bear. You just have to run faster than everybody else running from the bear. So if you take even basic level protections for yourself, change your passwords, make sure all your things are up to date, all your patches and software for your computers at home and your devices and things that your kids use. Make sure that those things are all up to date and you're already going to be better off than the next person. And just be more aware and make sure that your children and those around you, maybe even the elderly, are taken care of as well, because they might not be as up to speed on some of these technologies. Help them as well.
And are there any maybe policies that officials should maybe consider when it comes to improving cybersecurity in Canada?
Yeah, there's a place for legislation here for sure. I think the government can be doing more as far as helping businesses to develop and maintain security policies that are implement accountability mechanisms, right? Make sure that they're held accountable for when they have poor cyber hygiene or when they mistreat customers' data. We need to improve some of those protections for Canadians in order to make sure that this is better looked after.
And how does an expert such as yourself protect against cyber threats against your company, against your own personal information?
So I'm very fortunate. I work for an organization that develops these tools. So I'm constantly updating my tools and certainly my operating system and things for the devices that I'm using. But I also have the benefit of a number of researchers that are helping me to spot the threats. So I spend a lot of my time really helping others to spot those threats as well and become more aware.
All right, Mr. Falzon, about a minute left here, but if you could leave our viewers with just one message or one key piece of advice when it comes to cybersecurity, what would it be?
I would say to educate yourself, learn a little bit more and understand that, I always hear, hackers wouldn't be interested in me because I'm not interesting or I have nothing to hide or anything like that. It's one of the biggest fallacies. The problem is everybody's at risk. You, your parents, if you have children, them. Just make sure that you're taking the basic steps to protect yourself. Again, that will set you in a better place and make sure that you're not the next victim.
All right, Robert Falzon from Checkpoint Canada, thank you again for your time today.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back, and after the break, we're going to take a look at the major news stories and headlines from around the world, as at least 40 people are dead after a weekend airstrike in Ukraine. Protests continue at a coal mine in Germany. Flight data and voice recorders have been recovered from a plane crash site in Nepal, and a major Sicilian Mafia boss was arrested by authorities. These stories and more news from around the world coming up after the break. Forum Daily will be right back after these messages. Stay with us. The death toll from a weekend Russian missile strike on the Ukrainian city of Dnipro has risen to 40. Ukrainian authorities confirm 30 others remain missing after Saturday's missile attack on an apartment building in the southeastern city. Roughly 1,700 people lived in the building, and search and rescue crews are working nonstop to find victims and survivors among the wreckage. 39 people have been rescued so far. A Kremlin spokesperson has denied responsibility for the attack, saying the Russian military does not target residential buildings and that Ukrainian air defense actions are to blame. At least 14 people are dead after a church bombing in eastern Congo. Islamic extremists have claimed responsibility for the attack. They issued statements saying militants detonated an explosive device on Sunday inside a church where people were praying. The Allied Democratic Forces is a rebel organization which is believed to have links to the Islamic State group, and they have now carried out several attacks in Kasindi, located near the border with Uganda. Climate activists have occupied a giant digger at a coal mine in western Germany. This is to protest the destruction of a nearby village for the expansion of a separate mine. Energy company RWE told a German news agency that 4 people boarded the digger early Monday. Operations at the Hambach mine have been paused, and police have been informed. The village of Lützerath has become a flashpoint of protests in the past week. South Africa's president has canceled his trip to the World Economic Forum in Davos. He made the move in order to deal with his country's worsening power blackouts. Cyril Ramaphosa had been scheduled to lead a delegation to promote South Africa as an investment destination. But public outrage over the electricity crisis has forced him to hold urgent meetings at home. South Africa's state-owned power utility is currently implementing a high level of blackouts. Households and businesses are going without electricity for up to 10 hours daily until further notice. Anti-poverty group Oxfam says companies making big profits as inflation surges should face windfall taxes to help cut global inequality. Now, that's one of the recommendations in a report that the group released on Monday. This comes as the World Economic Forum's annual meeting of political and business elites gets underway in the Swiss ski resort of Davos. Oxfam also says over the past 2 years, the world's super-rich 1% have gained nearly twice as much wealth as the remaining 99% combined. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has notified Congress that the U.S. is projected to reach its debt limit on Thursday, and it will then resort to extraordinary measures to avoid default. Now, those measures include delaying some payments in order to provide some headroom to make other payments that are deemed essential. This includes those for Social Security and debt instruments. Ms. Yellen said on Friday that it is unlikely the extraordinary measures will be exhausted before early June. Search teams have recovered the flight data and voice recorders from the site of yesterday's plane crash in Nepal. At least 69 of the 72 people aboard the plane were killed after it plummeted into a gorge on approach to a new airport in the Himalayan foothills. It is the country's deadliest airplane accident in 3 decades. Millions of Californians remain under a flood watch. This comes in the aftermath of rain and snow that hammered parts of the state over the weekend. The weather made for dangerous travel conditions and prompted evacuation warnings across California. Italian police say they have arrested the country's #1 fugitive. Matteo Messina Denaro is a convicted mafia boss who ordered some of the nation's most heinous killings. He was arrested today at a private clinic in Sicily. The 60-year-old was receiving treatment for an undisclosed medical condition at the time of his arrest. Hundreds of police officers had been tasked with tracking Mr. Denaro down. Thousands turned out to bid farewell to Greece's former king today. They chanted, "Long live the king," and "Constantine, Constantine," as the casket carrying the country's last monarch emerged from Athens' Metropolitan Cathedral. This was after a funeral service attended by royalty from across Europe. Constantine passed away last week at the age of 82. The 4-day event celebrating African musicians across the continent culminated on Sunday evening in a stadium on the outskirts of the Senegalese capital of Dakar. This was the 8th edition of AFRIMA and the first to be held in a French-speaking country. Organizers say AFRIMA aims to connect African musicians to global markets while embracing the continent's cultural diversity and heritage. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.